And welcome to the Basketball Show on New Zealand Radio Sport. My name is Daniel and I'm your host. This is week 2 of the show. You can catch us every Tuesday at 8 o'clock where I talk about all the best NBA action for the week and occasionally other basketball, but mostly NBA because that's what it's all about. So without further ado, this week's show, we're going to start off with a bit of playoff chat. We're going to have the game of the week, which we'll do each week. I'll sort of post the best footage from what I think was a game of the week. A little bit of chat about season leaders in the bubble team. It's now finished the regular season and moved on to the playoffs. Stalking Steve, as usual, again, each week we'll have the best footage of what Steven Adams is up to for the week. We'll talk about the results. We've got our star of the week, which is another video. And then we'll finish off with a bit of playoff chat. So firstly, we'll just bring up the playoff bracket. There's our teams for the playoffs. Talked about last week that the East was all locked up with the 8 teams. And there were 3 teams fighting out for the final spot in the West. So Portland got that spot as the 8th seed, so they're now playing the Lakers, who were the 1st seed. The Blazers have been in a few good close games. The footage for this week's game of the week is Brooklyn versus the Blazers. The reason I've chosen this game was really close right down to the last shot. Could have won the game for Brooklyn. It was just a lot of to and fro in that last couple of minutes, so we'll get that footage up there.
Others to beat them and make shots.
Temple squeezes to Allen. His hook is good.
Where Allen is playing with a ferocity.
So it was a pretty high-scoring game. You can see
It collects it.
still 5 minutes left and 117, 122. So good high-scoring game.
Fading and hitting. Karras.
You saw him staying straight up. Wasn't quite as close on the contest.
Anthony from 3. He got it. A big second team foul on Portland. Here's LeVert. Guarded by Trent. LeVert, the nifty move. And Portland with the ball down just 1. Lillard sees Nurkic. He lays it in, and Portland
Beats Allen down the court.
Here's LeVert. The spin, the floater is good. Karras LeVert, the maturation continues.
1 point in it with 2.5 minutes to go.
Trent alone connects on a 3. Way out. Good movement here. TLC short. Another chance for Brooklyn. Harris got it. Tie game.
Where they have struggled at times or not necessarily been able to pick up
Tie game,
points.
less than 2 minutes to go.
That'll go minute to go. McCollum guarded by Harris. His jumper is good. He throws it into traffic. Another chance for Brooklyn. LeVert on the move. LeVert gets hit. Lays it in. Karras LeVert with 5 seconds left. LeVert going for the win. His jumper. No good. Portland wins and escapes to clinch the 8th seed.
So Karras LeVert, young guys, really stepped up in the last few games. Brooklyn have lost the 2 main point guards. Kyrie Irving decided not to be in the bubble, as did Spencer Dinwiddie. So LeVert's really stepped up and shown that he can carry a team. So next year with Kevin Durant joining the Brooklyn team, they should be really strong. So this year is not going to be Brooklyn's year, but Karras LeVert has showed he's a potential for the future. So we'll just talk quickly about the NBA has chosen their bubble teams for the season. So we'll just bring that up on the screen. You see here, the bubble was, I think, 10, 12 games. And the NBA has chosen their first team and second team based on who's performed best in this bubble. You see there, Karras LeVert's made the second team. First team has been Damian Lillard, who has been astonishing, really. I've got one of his stats here, which I'll bring up. So Damian Lillard has hit 54 out of 130 shots. That's 41.5% from more than 30 feet. So 30 feet is a heck of a long way from the rim. Just to put that into perspective, so Lillard's made 54 shots this season. The previous record for 30 plus feet was 25 shots. Stephen Curry, who's regarded as having the longest range in the game, the best three-point shooter, his career average from 30 plus feet is 26%. So 26%, and Lillard got 41.5%. And when he's on fire and he's hitting that shot with ease, it's just dribbling up with their space, he takes the shot. So it's pretty amazing what Damian Lillard's doing at the moment. So he's deservedly in the first team. That Brooklyn game, I think he had 42 points for the game. James Harden, again, has made the first team. James Harden now has to carry Houston through the first part of the playoffs with Russell Westbrook injured. We'll get into that shortly because they are playing the Oklahoma City Thunder. Luka Doncic, he played today, and he became only the fourth player younger than 21 years old to score 42 points. Score more than 40 points in the playoffs. So only the 44th player ever. Luka's had a pretty insane season. And TJ Warren, who has been exceptional in the bubble, his average for the year was about 18 points. In the bubble, he was averaging about 30 points. So we'll just move on to the season leaders. So we see there our points leaders for the season. James Harden, followed by Bradley Beal, Damian Lillard, who I just mentioned, in third there. Trae Young, only in his second season, another young talent. And Giannis Antetokounmpo. Probably said that wrong, but I try. LeBron, for the first time in his career, averaged more than 10 assists for the game. And he's the only player this year to assist more than have more than 10 assists in a game. Trae, as I just mentioned, a phenomenal young talent. In the top 5 of points and assists, so second there in assists with 9 again. Doncic as well, top 5 in points and assists, third-year player. And there in the rebounds, Andre Drummond leading the rebounds. Giannis there in third, so he's in the top 5 in points and in rebounds. Giannis is probably your MVP, most likely candidate at this stage. The best player on the best team has to win. I know there's a bit of a narrative around LeBron now being 35 years old and still having the output of one of the best players in the game, but he's not your MVP. Giannis is the MVP, but that will be announced, I think, in the next couple of weeks. Giannis has also got the highest PER ranking of any player ever. It was just under 33, beating Wilt Chamberlain's previous record. So your PER rating basically means how efficiently you play, how many points you score, how many points you create, how good your defense is, how many mistakes you make. All this accounts for your PER. So when you've got the highest PER ever, you're the most dominant player on the most dominant team, you're the MVP. Other interesting ones here is Ben Simmons, leader of steals. This year, the minutes, Damian Lillard is the winner of the highest minutes per game. CJ McCollum, his teammate, have got the second most amount of minutes. So it's really showing that Portland are dominated by those two players in their output. And the minutes is also a lot less than in previous seasons. In the early 2000s, guys like Allen Iverson were playing more than 40 minutes a game consistently. But because there's a lot more possessions in a game now, it's a lot quicker. It's moving up and down the court a lot faster. Players get worn down, obviously, so they're playing a lot less minutes than they were, 15, 20 years ago. Right. Our next segment, is Stalking Steve. So we're going to do this every week. This is what Steve's been up to.
Pope is heading right over to the athletic trainer on the campus of ESPN's Wide World of Sports. They make their own energy. JaVale McGee, and Adams went right through him and crashed to the court. Wow. The way that JaVale McGee landed on the back of his leg.
So Steve set out a few games.
I made 3 or 4 trips up the floor. I feel like his leg could fall off and he'd try to get up and down the floor. That's how tough he is. But that could not have been comfortable.
Dribble to Adams inside and one. Guess he's okay.
Steve played a few more minutes in that game, but then sat out a couple of games.
Adams drives all the way up to the rim and jams.
So this is when Steve came back about a week later.
Boston,
and he's looking pretty good.
Subtly, he's just been there.
He's going to be a big part of that Oklahoma City Thunder team.
Almost traveled. There's a slasher and a nice dish inside, and Adams flushes it home. Found something out here offensively, Mike. Dragic finally cools off momentarily. Completely different look. Dragic, Hero, Derek Jones, Myers Leonard, Solomon Hill. As that's Steven Adams down low. Billy Donovan going with his starting unit, Sans Lou Dort. So it's Terrence Ferguson getting his minutes to open up the third. Offensive rebound by Adams going right at Myers Leonard. Little baby hook shot. Cheer up some solid basketball.
Right, and you're going to stop. And now can you cash in those chips on the other end?
That'll be a foul. Easy call there. Is holding up.
They have in their scoring. Now, a lot of people are talking about, as Adams.
Steve only played about 18 minutes in that game. It's just getting him back into it before the playoffs came along. So he's had a good rest. Oklahoma City are playing tomorrow against the Houston Rockets. So today we had the first day of the playoffs, and we'll just bring up the results on screen. So today, the first game of the day was a ripper. Went into overtime where the Nuggets pulled away, but Jazz and the Nuggets was a fantastic game. 2 guys really stepped up in that game. Donovan Mitchell, who we've got a video of that we'll show shortly, but also Jamal Murray in the last 2 or 3 minutes of the game just took over. Him and Jokic played a bit of a 2-man game, a bit of pick and roll, which may not be to their favor when we get later into the playoffs and they come against a team who's got a more team-orientated game. 2-man basketball doesn't work so much anymore, but it may do. So it'll be interesting to see. But Jamal Murray was fantastic. Donovan Mitchell, see there with 57 points. So that's the 3rd highest points in the playoffs ever. So that puts it in perspective. And he's the youngest guy since Michael Jordan in, I think, 1987 scored 63 against the Celtics. He's the youngest player since him. So, yeah, Donovan, he's been amazing. Also, the second game of the day, Nets and the Raptors. The Raptors took off to a really big lead. They had a 25-point lead going into the half. The Nets came back in the second half, but it was never really a game there. Toronto is showing that they're a really strong lineup, and they've got a team of not really stars. Couple of guys who were all-stars, but no one you would call superstars. But they've got 4 or 5 guys on that team, similarly to Oklahoma City. you've got a bunch of guys who can contribute. So they're not relying on one or two people to have a huge game. Next game was between the Celtics and the Sixers. It was close most of the way through, but was never really in doubt that the Celtics were going to win that game. Tatum had a pretty good performance. Joel Embiid for the Sixers. And then our final game of the day, Mavs versus the Clippers. The Clippers won that game, but Luka, I've got another stat here. So Luka became just the fourth player, 21 years of age, to drop 40 points in a playoff game. So he's joined LeBron James, T-Mac, and Magic Johnson as the only other guys 21 years old to score 40 in the playoffs. So Luka is a bona fide star of the future. And those four teams that won today are probably the teams I'd predict to win those series. I didn't do a multi today, but if I did do a 4-team multi, it would have come out for me today because those were the teams I thought were the favourites and probably the teams that will win the series. And we'll just quickly go on to that Donovan Mitchell footage from today of him dropping 57 points.
Torrey Craig has historically presented problems for Mitchell. This time, Donovan Mitchell with a mismatch here. Tells Gobert to clear it out. Mitchell, oh, he punches it home and says it with his chest.
20 points first 3 years. Jokic, boy, oh boy, if you're 7 feet and you reach, Donovan Mitchell just says, that's a big mistake. And how about the adjustment as Grant comes over? Wow.
He double clutched on that.
My goodness, just elite level.
Amazing dunk.
That kind
this
of
guy is only 6'2".
Actually, it would be selfish of them as teammates not get over things. And
at least
you know what? Donovan Mitchell is feeling pretty good right now with that three ball.
Watch some of what he does. I mean, just off the easy screen, Rudy does such a tremendous.
Step back three. Heat check. Here's Mitchell, a chance to close out the half with a nice layup. Atoning for the turnover on that pass a moment ago. Mitchell coming up on the Toyota halftime. Jay on start here today. Sets the drag screen. Mitchell splits it up high and a terrific
member.
He's deserved it. Donovan Mitchell with the
second quarter. Do not relax. Don't take your foot off the gas.
So he's really good at squeezing between little gaps.
Gobert with the high ball screen.
So he can
Mitchell rolls it in on the reverse.
And again, another Rudy Gobert screen.
Good finger work on the rim.
Perhaps Michael Porter Jr. defensively.
Mitchell got all the way up to score. Now the switch has Monte Morris on him. The mid-range is
couldn't show a lot of his mid-range.
Settles for the three. Good decision. 38.
When he pulled up in the mid-range.
Gobert setting a good screen for three. Yes. Behind the Gobert screen. Driving. Mitchell finishing. 45. Donovan Mitchell downhill. Stopped on a dime. No change for Murray.
Separation with the step back. How about that? Ridiculous stop and pull into your jump.
And that was a star of the week, well, star of the day anyway. Let's see if anybody can beat that in the playoffs. So I think Utah really need Donovan to play like that every game. He scored 57 points and they still lost. So I think Denver are just far too strong. We'll just bring up the playoff bracket again there. So I'll just quickly go through the different matchups and who I think is probably going to win. We've just talked a little bit about the Eastern Conference. So the Bucks versus the Magic. The Bucks are just going to be far too strong. I think they'll probably whitewash that series 4-0 or 4-1. Don't think it will go past 5 games, but Giannis, Middleton, this Bucks team's been there a few times now for the last couple of seasons. Last year, getting beaten in the Eastern Conference Finals. Giannis is just so hungry to win, hungry to be the best, and he's the sort of guy who's going to carry a team, and you just get the feeling that the Bucks are going to get there. So sorry to say Magic. Heat versus the Pacers. This is going to be a really interesting series. It's going to be really close, I think. This might go through 7 games. Heat are playing really good team basketball. They've got a bunch of really good shooters in that team. Again, they don't really have superstars, but Jimmy Butler, he's been around a long time, been in a lot of playoff series. His leadership is key. He can be quite prone to doing stupid things and being a bit of a hothead. So it's about whether he can stay focused, and because they have got quite a young team. The Pacers, TJ Warren playing really well. It's going to be a really good series. It's a hard one to pick. I'm going to go with the Pacers, but we'll see. The third series there, the Celtics versus the Sixers. So the Celtics beat the Sixers today. The Sixers last year made the conference semi-finals. Again, this year they were going to be a threat, but they've lost Ben Simmons, their point guard, who's really influential to that team. Great defender, great facilitator. So his loss, I think, is going to be too much. This Celtics team's been in the playoffs for the last few years, but just haven't quite, gone on with that final step. So they've got a young, hungry team as well. It'll be really, really interesting to see how far they get. Easily, they should take the series against the Sixers, 4-1 or 4-2, I'm picking. Again, the Raptors and Nets is pretty one-sided. Raptors, I think, are going to be too strong. Last year's NBA winners, they lost Kawhi Leonard, but this year they've actually been a better team statistically. They've won more games than they did last year. So they've lost their best player and got better. So that's showing how good of a team they actually are. And they've been one of the top teams in the Eastern Conference for a number of years now. Back to when DeRozan was the star of the team and they were getting beaten by, I think they got swept a couple of times by the Cavs 4-0 in series, going back 4 or 5 years now. But this Raptor team is very strong. I think the Nets might get lucky and take 1 game in that series, but I would expect the Raptors to probably win that series in 5 or 6 games. In the next bracket we've got here, if we go over to the Western Conference, Lakers versus Portland. So this graphic I've got was a few days old before Portland beat Memphis in the playoff game. So last week I talked about it was down to potentially 3 teams taking that 8th spot in the Western Conference. Spurs, Memphis, and Portland. And the Suns. So there were 4 teams. On the Suns, I have to mention the Suns. So Devin Booker has been going absolutely crazy. It's talked about last week. They had no chance at the start of the bubble, but won 8 games, lost none, and still missed out on making the playoffs. They just didn't get the results go in their favor. So it came down to Portland and Memphis had a game, sort of a one-off game to decide who took that 8th seed. It was, again, a really good game. Portland took that one out. I think they went to overtime, actually. So Portland took that 8th seed. And the Lakers have got to be pretty scared about that. If there's one team who can be absolutely on fire with Lillard just, taking shots from 30, 40 feet at ease at 40+%. When he's on fire, he's just unstoppable. The Lakers in the bubble had, I think, the worst record at any of the teams in the bubble. They were well out in front in the Western Conference, but lost a whole bunch of games, still with the first seed, and they're actually the worst. I can't remember the exact stat, but they're the worst first seed in a long time in terms of their winning record, the ratio of wins to losses. They're one of the worst first seeds we've had. So in saying that, they've got LeBron. LeBron's been in the playoffs a number of times. He's been to 9 final series. So if there's any guy who's going to turn their team around, it's going to be LeBron. And you just kind of got the sense that they just weren't that engaged in those bubble games because it didn't really matter. They did look really lethargic, though, and just didn't look like there was much unity with the team. So it'll be interesting to see now what they're in the playoffs and they're playing against Portland, the team who's probably the hottest team at the moment. They had to be to come back from such a poor start to the season. They've got Nurkic back at center, who's a really key guy in their team. The game against the Grizzlies to take that 8th seed, Nurkic had something like 20 points and 20 rebounds. So he's a real key to that team. Carmelo Anthony, after not having a contract for a little while, he's been a real key member of that team as well. It's actually starting to embrace that bench role of a guy who's just supposed to come on and, take easy shots and not try and be the hero of that team. He's finally understood that that's where he now stands. So that team against the Lakers could actually knock them off as the 8th seed. So that's going to be a really interesting series. It's a hard one to pick. It's hard to see LeBron losing, even though the Blazers are so hot at the moment. So I'm picking the Lakers in 6 or 7 games in that series. The next series here, Thunder versus the Rockets. So this is a really interesting one, and shout out to the Thunder here. Really interesting because in the off-season, the Thunder traded Russell Westbrook, their star for a number of years, traded him to the Rockets for Chris Paul and a bunch of draft picks. So basically, this year was going to be a rebuilding year for the Thunder. They weren't expected to be a playoff team, let alone the 5th seed. ESPN at the start of the year, they had their fancy little algorithms to work out who they think is going to make the playoffs. They gave the Thunder 0.3% chance to even make the playoffs. And here they are in the 5th seed. So they're playing the Rockets, who have their former star in Russell Westbrook, but is actually injured. So it's a little bit disappointed because this Thunder team would be so fired up to play against Russell Westbrook, their old mate. They know how he plays. They know his strengths and weaknesses. But equally, Chris Paul wasn't treated very well from the Rockets and from James Harden. Even though he's getting on in his career and he's shown this year, he's still an immense talent, and he should be utilized more by that Rockets team. But he was kind of told to take a back step and let James Harden take over, which was clear that he didn't like because he is a leader. So he's going to be fired up in this series. And I really think the Thunder, because Russell Westbrook's not in this series, the Thunder should probably take it out in 6 or 7 games. Next series is the Nuggets and the Jazz. Just mentioned before, Jazz with Donovan Mitchell scoring 57 points today, and he kind of needs to do this in every game for them to have a shot. It's just too much. Nuggets in 5 games, I think. The final series here, Clippers versus the Mavs. Again, the Mavs are a team for the future. They're 2 young stars in their team. Porzingis, who was ejected today for his second technical, which was for very little. And sometimes in the playoffs, they let the teams play a bit harder and a bit more aggressive. So it's a bit disappointing to see that ejection. Luka Doncic, he's just a freak, this guy. But again, they're going to need Doncic to score 40, 50 points a game, I think, to beat the Clippers. The Clippers just have too much firepower. They're actually the first team to have 4 players average above 18 points a game. So the 2 stars of the team, Paul George, Kawhi Leonard, and then the 2 bench star, Lou Williams and Harrell. So the first pair to be averaging 18 points or more off the bench. So they've got a number of guys in that team who can score, and they've got guys like Patrick Beverley who just like to get under people's skins, and they play hard, and they just have a lot of fight. So I'm picking with Kawhi in this team. The Clippers are going to go at least to the conference semifinals. So I'm picking this series in 5 or 6 games to take care of the Mavs. And that's all we've got time for this week. We'll see you next week at 8:30. This was the Basketball Show on New Zealand Sport Radio.